Okay, the project we're going to talk about today is a lidded box. Now, the lidded box is characteristically small. It doesn't have to be very big. If it gets very big, you can't hold it in one hand while you take the lid off with the other. Now, you want a fit with the lid that is tight enough to where it will stay on securely and it won't fall off. But it's easy enough to get off with a little bit of pressure. Another nice thing about a lidded box is the ability to line up the grain, where you can actually see the grain continuously through the base into the lid. It's easier to do that when you're using straight grain wood. It's much more difficult to do this when you get into the highly figured woods. But it is actually still possible. There's a couple of ways that you can do it. The problem is when you cut the shoulder on here, that extends up into the lid, and that can mess up the alignment. So they're fairly easy to make. It requires a great deal of patience to get the fit between the base and the lid. But other than that, it's a fairly easy project to turn, and we'll get into that in just a moment. Now, as we start on this lidded box, since we're going to start turning it between centers, the first thing we need to do is to find the center on both ends. And the easiest way to do that is with a center finder. And as you know, you need to go to all four corners and on both ends. Now, once we get the center located, we need to mark the center. We need a center punch. Now, there's a couple of ways that you can do that. You can use an awl, which is fairly simple to use. You just find the center, and that gives you the center of the piece. There's another tool that you can use. It's a spring-loaded center punch. And this is spring-loaded, and it will go in and out. And once it goes far enough back, it goes over center, and the spring pushes back. And it looks something like this. You find your center, and as you push, the center punch will go over center, and then it will make your mark. So there's just two different ways to accomplish basically the same thing. Now, you'll take your spur drive, put the point in the center punch that you just punched. Take your live center and put that in your tailstock, and then you simply find the point where you can go into the hole with a point on your live center, and you have your piece turning between centers. And now we'll turn the piece round, and we'll cut the tenons on each end, and we'll do that in the next segment. Okay, now we've got our piece mounted, we've got our two rests set up, we spin it by hand to make sure it's going to clear, and now we're just going to turn this round. We're not looking for a specific diameter. We just want to get the largest cylinder we can get out of this piece of wood. Well, we've still got a little piece of bark right there. We'll take that off. Now, our piece is round. Now we just need to take a parting tool and we'll cut a 3/8 inch tenon on each side. And remember, the size of this tenon depends on the size of the jaws on your particular chuck. Now, for mine, I'm going to turn this to about 1 3/4 inches because I know that's what's going to fit well into my chuck. Now that's about 1 13/16, so we're going to go down just a little bit more. Now, because the shape of this lidded box is going to be entirely up to you, part of the project is for you to design your own. So we'll let you do that. I'll pick a design for this one, but the first thing you have to decide is how much of the box is going to be the lid and how much is going to be the base. Now there's a lot of debate about how it goes and what the best proportions are, but what I have found is that about 1/3 works about right. Now we have about 4 inches on here, so I'm going to mark my lid at about 2 3/4. Now that'll roughly give me 1/3 for the lid and 2/3 for the body, and that's generally enough. If you're putting some kind of fancy finial on the top, then you would have started with a longer piece. So there's a lot of different ways that you can do it. But generally speaking, 2/3 and 1/3 is a pretty good place to start. You can't go wrong with that proportion. Now, in order to cut this though, we're going to have to take it off and go to the bandsaw. So we'll get set up to do that, and we'll cut this on the bandsaw in the next segment. Now again, because this is round, we don't want to just put it up here and try to go into this blade with something round. Because as you can see, where the tabletop is and where the saw blade starts, there's a large portion of this piece that is not supported by the tabletop. And if you do that, it has a tendency to want to spin. That can pull the piece out of your hand, it can jam it in the blade, it can mess up your blank, and it can take off a finger if you're really unlucky. So we would never do that. This is why we're going to use a miter gauge. Now the miter gauge is set up where the support goes all the way to the blade. We can put this on here. Now we can hold the piece against two surfaces that are 90 degrees to one another, the tabletop and the back of the miter gauge. So this will give us the support that we need to keep this piece from getting away from us. So we just line up our line on the blade, and make our cut. Now, this gives us our base with a tenon and our lid with a tenon. So we can attach these to the lathe and turn them. And we will do that in the next segment. Now, we're set up now to actually hollow out the inside of our lid. Now, there's a number of different ways that you could do this and a number of different shapes. The thing you have to consider is you already have to know how you're going to shape the outside of your lid. And that's what's going to determine how much you take out from the inside. We need to go back at least 3/16, maybe 1/4 of an inch for our lid, for our mating surfaces between the lid and the base. But above and beyond that, we can make some decorative work in here as well. But again, if we're not careful, if we take out too much inside here, it limits what we can do on the outside. So you have to have in mind what you're going to do on the outside, and that's going to determine how much you can remove on the inside. Now, your parting tool is a good place to start. Now, what we're going to do here is start with a wide shoulder, and then we're going to gradually decrease the size of the shoulder until we get down to the point where we're comfortable with it. We don't want to get this shoulder too thin, and at the same time we don't want it too wide. Generally speaking, about 3/16 of an inch is ideal. And you don't have to do a lot of measuring on this side. Because we're going to make the base match this. So you don't really have to measure this because you're going to make the other one match it. So we're going to take off just a little bit more. We're still a little bit big here. Now, the important thing about this shoulder is, number one, the depth. You don't want to go too deep, but at the same time, you don't want to be real shallow either. Usually about a 3/16 depth is good. A 1/4 inch, you wouldn't want to go any bigger than a 1/4 of an inch, and certainly no less than an 1/8 of an inch. So 3/16 is a good, happy medium. Now, the important thing about that shoulder is that it be parallel to the center line of the lathe. If this is toed in or toed out, even a little bit, it's going to adversely affect the way it's going to fit onto the base. So we want this to be straight. Ideally, you would measure that, but most people don't have the equipment to do that with. So you're just going to have to be very, very careful that you're going straight in and that you cut that perfectly straight from front to back. Once we have that, then we're actually finished with the shoulder. You don't want to sand in here because there's no way that you can get sandpaper in here to do anything but mess up your fit. So you want a good sharp tool, and you want to cut it cleanly, and then you leave your shoulder alone. Now I'm going to cut a second shoulder that's going to define my shape for the inside. So I'm going to back off a little bit, and again, it doesn't matter how much. And that gives us a secondary shoulder. Now, here's where I have to decide exactly what I'm going to do with this. And because of what I'm going to do on the lid, I can't go very deep. So I'm going to do the rest of it I can do some of it with the parting tool. Now I'm going to switch to a bowl gouge, and I'm going to take out a little bit more. Now we've got a little bit of a depression back up in here. That's about as far as I can go. Now this part we can sand. I'm not going to waste a lot of time sanding that on camera. So we'll stop now, and I'll get this sanded, and then we'll come back and I'll show you how to flatten the end. Okay, now we've got it sanded and we're ready to proceed. Now our lip right here is not completely flat. You can see as that turns, it's got some wobble to it. So we need to clean that up and get it perfectly flat. If we don't get this perfectly flat, it's not going to fit well into our base. So we're just going to use a pull cut and just clean that up. Now, that might get it perfectly flat, but it could be towed in or towed out, and it would be very hard to tell. If it's towed in a little bit, it wouldn't matter that much, but if it's towed out, it could leave a gap between your lid and the base. So we need this to be perfectly flat. Now to make that happen, I use a block, this is 1/2 inch Baltic birch plywood, and a piece of sandpaper. Now what I'm going to do is take this perfectly flat surface and put it over the entire thing at one time. And then it has to come out flat. It really has no other choice. It can't cut at an angle, it can't toe in and toe out. So we'll turn the speed down to about 800, and we just hold that against it. And that's going to get us a perfectly flat surface. And you can use this trick anytime you need a perfectly flat surface. It doesn't work as well if it's solid, but it works very well when you just have a shoulder that you're taking down. So we now have that perfectly tight. Now we need to know how deep this is so we can cut the base to match. Now that's at 5/32. So we want to make sure that when we cut the shoulder on our base that it's a little bit less than that, so the lid can fit all the way down flush on this surface and not land on the shoulder on the inside. So right now we're pretty much finished with our lid, except for one thing. We need to do a little bit of finishing on the inside now that it's on the lathe. And what I like to use to do that is beeswax. This is just a hard chunk of beeswax I purchased many years ago, and I'm still using it. And you simply use friction to soften and melt the wax into the entire inside. And then we'll spread it out and polish it with a rag. But it looks something like this. And this is just a cut up old t-shirt. Now the more that you rub on the inside and the harder you push, the more heat you're going to generate, and that's going to melt the wax and distribute it evenly. And you can bunch up the rag to get into that corner, and you can actually distribute that wax even deep in that inside corner. And now we have the inside finished. We won't have to go back and try to do that later. And now we're actually finished with the inside. That's all we're going to do to that right now. And then we'll change this to the base of our lidded box, and we'll turn that. Then we'll put the two together, and we'll turn the outside of the two pieces at the same time. Okay, now we've got our lid completely turned on the inside. We still have to do the outside, but we'll do that at the same time that we turn the outside of the body of the lidded box. Now what we have to do now is get a shoulder on our body that matches the shoulder that we've cut for the lid. And it has to be a nice snug fit. It's something you have to do slowly. You have to sneak up on your actual dimension for this slot, or for the shoulder. The first thing though, we need to get a little relief on the inside. We want to take out a little bit on the inside so that we can flatten the end without having to flatten the whole thing. So we'll just do a little relief. So now we have a little relief. So we would be sanding a much smaller area. And then we just reduce the speed down to about 800. And we can use the plywood block. Now sometimes it's hard to tell whether or not you've gotten it flat. Now a good trick to use in a case like this is to take a pencil and just put a series of pencil marks around the edge that you want to sand. And once all of those marks are off, then it's flat. And then all of our pencil marks are gone, so we'll know that it's flat. Now we're going to switch to some 220 grit and put a little bit better edge on this. And now we're ready to start on the outside and cut down our shoulder that's going to mate with our lid. Now again, this is something that you have to do very slowly and carefully, removing a very small amount of material at a time. And you want to make sure that the shoulder that you cut is not deeper than the shoulder that you cut on the lid. Now we knew that was 5/32, so we'll know to keep it a little bit less than 5/32. Now we've got our caliper set at the 2 5/16, which is pretty close to what we had there, and we can just use this to tell when we're getting a little bit closer to the mark. With the fit. So I need to take off just a very, very small amount in here, and I'll have the fit that I'm looking for. So we're just going to go very, very slowly. The difference here between a good fit and no fit at all is probably less than 1/1000 of an inch. Now, you see it's beginning to go on, but not quite. So we just took off a very, very small amount. And now we have a fit. And that's about the amount of pressure that we want for it to come off. So that's how you do a tight fit. The secret to success is to take a very, very small amount of material at a time. Now we're still not quite finished. when I put this on, I see a gap between the lid and the body, which tells me that my shoulder here is too high. It's not allowing the outside of this to come down to meet the body. So I'm going to have to shorten the shoulder on the inside. Now we'll just do that with a parting tool. And now I get the fit I'm looking for. My lid goes all the way down and touches the lid. Now another thing that you can do that will give you a really good fit, and again, everything that you do at this stage on this fit has to be done very, very carefully. But if I can undercut this lip just a little bit, now we're not talking much, I'm going to use the skew. And I'm just going to remove a small amount. And that will ensure a really tight fit across that. And again, that's the fit that we're looking for. So, the only thing left to do on the inside is to hollow it out to whatever degree and whatever shape we want. And it's going to be kind of like what we did on the lid. We couldn't go very deep in here because of what I was going to do on the outside. So it's the same thing here. I'm going to put a foot on the bottom of this lid, the bottom of the base, and so it's going to limit how much of this I can hollow. So we'll increase the diameter here in our recess to get a little bit closer to the shoulder. But again, we want to leave at least 3/16 of an inch for that shoulder. And we will, there's several different ways that we can take out material from the inside. We could use a bowl gouge and take that out. We could actually drill it out with a box core bit if we wanted a semicircular bottom. We could use any number of scrapers that would get the job done. But I'm going to use my parting tool first to increase that diameter. And that's about what I want. It's about 3/16 of an inch. And now I can hollow that out any way that I would like. What we can do is use a hollowing tool. This is one of the Easy Wood Tool hollowers. It's the straight one. They make two curved ones that go with it. And this would allow me to hollow this out quickly to whatever shape I'd like. Now the secret to success with this tool is to stay on the center line. So I adjust my tool rest to put my cutter right on that center line. Now that's about what I'm looking for hollowing. It's pretty much a hemisphere, and I'll just do a little sanding on the inside of that, and then I'll coat that with the beeswax, the same as we did the inside of the lid. So let me do that, and then we'll be back and shape the outside. Okay, now we have the inside sanded, and we put the beeswax on it, and the beeswax also went on the groove and the flat on here, the same as it was on here. And we still have the fit that we're looking for. Our next step is to turn the outside. Now, one of the advantages of only taking off a small amount of material at a time is, or at least removing a minimum amount of material on the inside, particularly if the wood has straight grain, is you can line up the grain from top to bottom, almost all the way around. And that there are people that like to decorate the seam between the base and the lid. And essentially what they're doing is they're hiding any kind of imperfections. I really like to have an invisible seam as much as possible. So I don't put much decoration between the lid and the base. And I like to see the grain continue up both of them. Now, our next step is going to be to bring up the tailstock with a live center to hold this in place, and then we can do all of our turning on the base and the lid, or at least most of it, and then get the two of them turned at the same time so the outside contours are continuous. So we'll do that in the next segment. Now, we brought up the tailstock with a live center, and we now have both pieces to where they're firmly attached, and they will turn together on the lathe, and then we can do our shaping on both of them at the same time. Now, what I want to do is put a small foot on the bottom of it, and I'll do that with a detail gouge. Now, I think it might help if I change the camera angle so you can see a little bit better what I'm doing with the tool. So let's do that, and I'll be right back. Okay, we're back, and now we have a better camera angle. I'd like you to see what I'm doing with the tool and how I'm riding the bevel with it. So when you come in through here, you're actually riding the bevel as you're going around to make your cut. And it's the same thing on this side. I'm riding the bevel. So it's just a matter of continuing to work the foot in. Now you notice as I go around this contour, I have to start with my handle way back here. I get on the bevel, the flute is fairly closed, and once I get it to cut, I have to swing the handle around to maintain the cut. And I can follow that cut all the way around just by swinging the handle to keep the bevel engaged. Now on this side it's exactly the same thing, except I'm swinging the handle in the opposite direction. Now, that's pretty much the shape I want for the bottom. Now, the top is going to be a little bit different. And I'm going to work the bowl gouge on that a little bit. It'll be basically the same thing. The tool is just bigger. But I will be on that bevel the same way, and I swing the handle pretty much the same way. The bowl gouge just removes a lot more material a lot faster. Now what I'm going to try to do with this, I'll clean up this base a little bit more, but the lid I'm pretty much done with. What I want to do is bring this up sort of to a point, and I'll have to do that using another trick that I'll show you in just a minute. But let me kind of finish as much as I can. Now I'll have to go back to the detail gouge to finish that down in here. Now the rest of that I can sand. Now I'm going to go ahead and sand all of this and get it smooth. And then I'm going to show you another trick that will allow you to remove the tailstock and get the lid finished. And we'll do that in just a moment. Okay, we have a new camera angle, and what we're going to do with this now is actually take the tailstock back. We'll remove the lid, and now I've got the outside of the base sanded, and I'm going to go ahead and put the beeswax finish on the whole thing. This is probably one of the fastest finishes that you can install on a piece. And now, that's a good finish. It's a nice piece of wood. It was a piece of slightly spalted maple. Now, we are ready to take it off the lathe. Now, we will have to cut this tenon off and finish the bottom off the lathe, but we can do that later. What I want to do now is show you how to finish off this lid. We have a recess in here, and we can expand these chuck jaws until that will hold, and then we can finish turning the top of the lid. And I'm going to do all of it, I believe, with a bowl gouge. And it will look something kind of like this. You do have to go a little bit slower and more careful when you're suspending by something that you can't put a whole lot of pressure on. If I put a lot of pressure, I run the risk of marring the inside of the lid, and I don't want to do that. And that's about the shape I want. And all I have to do is do a little bit of finish sanding on it. And then I'm ready to finish the outside of that with the beeswax. And that's all there is to it. We're ready to take that off. And there's our box. We can line up the grain, and all we have to do is take that tenon off the bottom, and that's a fairly simple thing. There's a number of ways you can do it. We can put that on a bandsaw and cut most of it off. We can sand the rest of it on a Norwegian steam-powered sander. There's a lot of ways that we can do that. But I don't really think I need to show you. You guys know how to remove a tenon. So that's your lidded box.